So welcome everybody. We're really excited to have you in class today. Today's class is all about women's fight for equality. We're going to talk about the 19th Amendment. We're going to talk about other voting amendments, but it's really based in the fight for women's equality in the United States. So many things to talk about. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. We're going to go through all this in 30 minutes. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. It's fantastic how many schools are with us already in the chat from all over the country. And to have our little fun conversation lecture and tour through American history with a lens on women's rights, we are here with our Chief Content Officer, Tom Donnelly. Tom, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Curry, and thank you everyone for being here.
Tom, there's a lot to go through, and you know we always have a bazillion questions in the education team. Tom's a part of the education team and adds to those bazillion questions. So many questions about the fight for equality for women. We want to talk about Seneca Falls. We want to talk about some key female leaders over time, the connection between the women's fight for equality, the fight for the vote, and also the fight for civil rights. And I know that's a tall order to get through all of those pieces, but I thought it would be really important to kind of start with what was life like for women in the colonies, in the early time periods in early America, because sometimes we think about, 1920s and the 19th Amendment, and we think about the women's fight for equality only in that time period, but it's really different, the women's equality in the early America. So can you start us there and say kind of what were the rules and the laws and the rights of women in the early colonial period? So we're talking 1750s time period?
Yeah, absolutely, Curry. So, I'll say a little bit about voting rights, and then we'll go out more broadly to, the law that existed in other areas to give a sense of this. So, America declares its independence in 1776. It begins to write new state constitutions. A little over a decade later, we get the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution itself leaves a lot of big issues to state and local governments. That's our system of federalism. Among them are the rules set for elections and voting. So if you're talking about colonial America up to the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, so that founding period, and voting, what we see is that most states establish property requirements for voters. And so during this period, voting is generally restricted to white male property holders. And so, in this context, women are excluded from the vote for the same reasons that many other groups are at the founding. So whether it's the poor, the people without property, all of those groups of people were seen as groups of people that were dependent on others. The idea being that the vote is connected to whether or not you can be free and independent and exercise your own judgment. And that view at the founding was that there were certain groups that could do that, white male property holders, but many other groups could not, women being among them. So there was one exception, key exception here in early America. My home state of New Jersey actually allowed women the right to vote. Unmarried female landowners could vote in state and local elections from 1776, so when the Declaration of Independence, up to 1807. So that's over 30 years of voting for unmarried female landowners in New Jersey. However, in 1807, New Jersey closed off that period of women's suffrage, limiting the vote to, quote, free white male citizens. So that's a bit about what we get when it comes to voting. More broadly, though, we also have another system of laws that relates specifically to women. And so if we're thinking about, the women's rights movement that extends from the 1800s all the way up to the 19th Amendment's ratification in 1920 and beyond, these early conventions for women's rights focus not so much on the vote, but on other sets of laws and other forms of inequality facing women. So they're focused primarily on increasing the rights for married women. And so if we're looking during this founding era into the 1800s, married women do not have the right to hold property on their own, to enter into contracts, to sue or be sued. And again, they also don't have the right to vote. And these rules are written into the law itself. It's what's known, the fancy word for this is the law of coverture. But basically, this just means it's a legal doctrine that husbands assume the legal rights and responsibilities of their wives when they became married. So married women lose many of these rights that they had as unmarried women. And then more broadly, if we're thinking about the political power of women, again, women are conceived of as being part of a household that's led by a male head of household. the man in the household is the main voice for women in public life and in voting. And as a result of this, for those who oppose the women's right to vote during the founding era, the big theory they rely on is what's known as the theory of virtual representation. The idea being that women don't need the right to vote because they're already represented by their husbands. What we see as we get into the 1800s and the women's rights movement grows and grows, we see the women suffragists and women reformers push back against this and really push back against this system of male dominance.
So, couple questions there. So I love the word coverture, and I feel like it defines itself. It's like to cover, to conceal. It's like this idea that the men are covering, concealing the women. It's almost, they're supposed to be representing them, but it's almost the name itself explains like you feel like suffocated as well. But one thing I wanted to point out, married women are trying to, don't have any of these rights and are fighting for the rights. It's the husband that's speaking for them. But it's not like unmarried women have a ton of other freedoms, right? I just want to clarify that.
Oh yeah, no, as a matter of custom and no, not at all. But in particular, this whole doctrine, this part of it is written into the law and therefore seems to be a clear target for reformers where they can get it written out of the law.
Do you think that is because they believe that like a married woman is like an adult? Like, is there a reason why they think it's easier to win that area when they start? And we're talking about we're talking about these amazing people that start the fight to say, married women should have these rights because they're, more likely to get that movement first than unmarried younger women?
Yes, I think so. I think there's a practical element to it. I think, again, it's, those would be, you would think of within a society where you have greater equality between men and women. Those are the women most likely to be in leadership roles in elite society. And so it's, I think, no accident that would be an area that's in the topic of a push for reformers.
Great. Okay, so tell us what the reformers tried to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we begin to see these pushes against things like the rule of coverture. We begin to see early pushes for women's suffrage. And what we see are women reformers relying on so many of the tools we've seen reformers rely on throughout American history. Things like petitioning, the press, speaking, these rights, assembling, all of these rights that we see enshrined in the First Amendment. We see early successes when it comes to getting rights for married women, like things like the Married Women's Property Act of 1848, which was a key victory for reformers in New York. And then we see most famously in 1848, a gathering in Seneca Falls, New York, known as the Seneca Falls Convention. It's organized by abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. It's a local gathering of around 300 people. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton ends up preparing a manifesto for this particular gathering called the Declaration of Sentiments. It's literally, if you read it, it's not too long. You could find it online. She literally rewrites the Declaration of Independence. And so here's, just to give you a flavor for it, here's some key language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And so we're seeing all the way from the Seneca Falls Convention, this gathering, women reformers relying on some of the key arguments that you found during the American Revolution, during the founding, rooting this push for reform in America's founding principles. And so in the end, what we see Stanton and her colleagues here do is they rewrite the Declaration of Independence, and rather than having grievances against King George III, they express grievances against men, expressing all the forms of inequality that we find in society. And so the Declaration, it closes with a list of 12 specific demands, including a demand for equal education, equal pay, equal property rights, and the, quote, sacred right to the elective franchise. So there we could see how women's suffrage is intertwined with all of these other ways in which women are pushing for greater equality within American society.
We were talking before class started about artifacts and documents in our exhibit, and this is actually one of the documents in the exhibit that the person that was in yesterday was actually showing us too. So it's cool if you're ever in Philadelphia, come check out the exhibit and you'll see an image just like this and the actual document, the pamphlet that was given out at that meeting, it right there in the exhibit. But the women declare kind of this grievances among to men, and there's a lot of reasoning behind this. What is the level of violence and devastation that a woman is under in a marriage in America at this time? They have no ability, especially if they don't have means, they have no ability to keep themselves safe or their children safe. Tom, tell us a little bit about that, and then the men that kind of help support women in this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it is a reminder. You have a combination of the law and custom that reinforces these forms of inequality. Some of them are the formal ways we talked about when it comes to rights to property. Some of them also have to do with the relationship between man and woman inside a marriage, and the degree to which the law can intervene in instances of violence, of abuse, of things like that. And frankly, it's a combination, again, of both law and custom that traps women in really awful situations. And so part of the push here is a push, again, sort of broadly, not just for the franchise, but for greater equality across a lot of dimensions. And this early suffragist movement, it's a movement of white Americans, African Americans, men, women. And so we see, this picture is a great example. After the Seneca Falls Convention, we see the first National Women's Convention. It meets in Massachusetts. I know we have some classes from Massachusetts here today, but so Massachusetts, on the vanguard of pushing for women's equality, it draws the attendance of 1,000 people. So it's a big convention. And so we see some big names here, people like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls too. And so he's a key supporter of both ending enslavement, but also pushing for women's rights. We see other key figures like abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. And in the middle, we see there another person who was an important abolitionist, but also a supporter of women's rights and women's suffrage, Sojourner Truth. This is all a reminder that as we're in the middle of the 1800s, it's a little bit before the start of the Civil War, we see a broad set of reformers pushing for a new America that gets rid of slavery. So many of these people are abolitionists, but a new America that also provides greater equality for women. Many of these reformers are also suffragists.
It's so powerful. So I know this is going to be really hard for you, Tom, but could you walk us through the Reconstruction time period pretty briefly? That's the part that's going to be hard, the briefly part, because what we see is this coalescing of all different aspects of people working together to find freedom, to find equality to end slavery, equality for representation in your home, in your government, all these pieces. But then, there's also a bit of a split. So I don't think we can talk about the split after Reconstruction if we don't talk about the aligning before Reconstruction. So the hard part is that you won't really get to just talk about Reconstruction.
That is always very hard for me, Curry. I will resist the urge. But so yes, the nation, we fight a civil war. The Civil War ends. It brings with it emancipation. So the great goal of the abolitionist movement is achieved through first the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War, and then the framing and ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. It's ratified in 1865. And so again, abolitionists and suffragists were often working hand in hand leading up to the Civil War, pushing for reform for both African-American men and all women. And we see the same push happen during Reconstruction, which is the period after the Civil War. We see these old abolitionists and suffragist allies, women, men, white, African-American, working together for a broad and inspiring vision of universal rights, including universal suffrage. So much like before the Civil War, these reformers saw African-Americans and women sort of linked together, a linked faith that was going to lead to greater equality and greater freedom for everyone. We see a similar push after the Civil War. And so a great statement of this, it happens in 1866 by a key figure called Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And so there's another big convention in 1866 bringing together old abolitionists and folks who are supporting African-American suffrage and women's suffrage. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, she's an African-American. She's born free. She's educated in Baltimore. In 1852, she joins the abolitionist speaking circuit. So she's another one of these key reformers, both an abolitionist and a suffragist. She's a poet. She's an outspoken reformer, and she speaks at the National Women's Rights Convention in May 1866. This convention founds the American Equal Rights Association, which is important in the push for voting rights. And here's her broad vision she lays out during this convention. Here's what Harper says. She says, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving a curse in its own soul." So we have a sense here in 1866 from the reformers that we've won a civil war, We've used the power of the national government to get rid of slavery. Everything seems possible. Everything, including voting rights for both African-American men and all women. But we see this vision of universal suffrage, of universal rights, unfortunately collapse shortly thereafter. In part, it's in the debates over key amendments that happened during Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Part of the reason why we end up seeing the party in power, the Republican Party, which is the party of Lincoln, the party of union, they prioritize African-American rights over women's rights. And so part of the reason is some of the politicians, they frankly just believe in the traditional role of women in the home. And so they have those sorts of values. They're not pushing at the vanguard when it comes to women's rights. But we also see both the 14th and 15th Amendment prioritize African-American men over all women. The 14th Amendment, Section 2, writes the word male into the Constitution for the first time, promoting specifically male voting rights. And then the 15th Amendment shows the priority of really looking to advance African-American rights over women's rights. The 15th Amendment promised to ban racial discrimination in voting. It was ratified in 1870. And so this move by the people in power, the Republican Party, who are the allies of the abolitionists and the suffragists, to prioritize African Americans over women, splits the suffragist movement. It splits the women's rights movement in half. And the key group there, it basically splits it into two different groups. One is the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is associated with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They oppose the 15th Amendment, and they turn and they focus on creating a national women's suffrage movement. They think that's the priority. We're going to say no to the 15th Amendment, no to our old allies in the Republican Party. We're going to focus on women's suffrage. We see some of their allies, though, form another group called the American Women's Suffrage Association. These are people like Lucy Stone and Henry Brown Blackwell, and they stick with their old allies and still advance a vision of universal rights. So they support the 15th Amendment. They continue to support the Republican Party, but they also remain committed to a vision of universal rights, including universal suffrage.
And Tom, you kind of said it earlier, but I just want to clarify, is the fact that, you know, the radical Republicans and the Republicans that are kind of moving the 13th, 14th, and 15th through, is it the fact that they really don't want women to get the right to vote? Or is it they don't think they'll get it passed because it's African-American males and women? Or is it some kind of mix of the two?
Oh, it's definitely a mix of the two, and you see both of those things there. I mean, like there was definitely a sense that it was going to be hard just to get African-American male suffrage effectively written in the Constitution through the 15th Amendment. So they, you know, as a practical matter, might have thought women's suffrage would have made that an impossible lift. But there are also plenty of Republicans who also do hold to traditional ideas of women's role in the home that also led them away from the push for women's suffrage. So it's both.
So it's both, yeah. Just wanted to be realistic about the past and like honest about it too. Now we've got this next kind of wave of women kind of pushing for the right to vote, but even before the 19th Amendment. So what were some of the like legal tactics and behaviors that they were trying to ensure that women could still vote?
Yeah, so I mean, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. The 15th Amendment banning racial discrimination in voting is ratified in 1870. And so we have these suffragists who are really frustrated with the party in power prioritizing African-American men over all women, but they don't abandon the Constitution. And so as we get into the 1870s, we see really, really important suffragists embracing the Constitution as it's amended and effectively trying to use, especially the 14th Amendment, to argue that the US Constitution already protects women's suffrage. And you see this in two different ways. One path is a turn to Congress. And so here the key figure is suffragist Victoria Woodhull, who argues before Congress saying that, look, the 14th Amendment, what did it do? Part of what it did is that it gave Congress the power to pass new laws that enforce the privileges or immunities of US citizenship. So effectively what she's saying is, Congress, after the 14th Amendment, you could pass laws that enforce big national rights. We women, we're United States citizens, and what is a bigger, more important national right than the right to vote? So the 14th Amendment, it already protects the women's right to vote. Congress, do your job and pass a law that grants women the right to vote nationwide. Here's Woodhull's really powerful statement. She says, I do now claim that I am equally with men possessed of the right to vote. So in 1871, Woodhull appears before a House committee to present her argument. And so she's the first woman to do so. So she doesn't succeed. But this is an idea. One thing you might do is you might go to Congress and try to get Congress to enforce the Constitution as it exists. We see another group of suffragists turn to the courts and make very similar arguments to what you saw Woodhull make before Congress. And so this is known as the new departure. And so you see suffragist leaders make arguments in court. It culminates, as Curry already flashed there, in a case called Minor v. Happersett. And so you're seeing these women throughout the country, white women, African-American women, going to the poll, going to their local officials, going to the poll saying, we have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. A case coming out of the new departure ends up before the Supreme Court. It's in many ways maybe the first important voting rights case ever before the Supreme Court. Is called Minor versus Happersett. Virginia Minor, who you see on the screen there, is a big, she's an important suffragist. She is pushing for these new departure arguments. And so in this case, she challenges a St. Louis registrar's decision to block her from registering to vote. She argues again, much like Woodhull did, that under the 14th Amendment, women were US citizens, and effectively that voting is a privilege of national citizenship protected by the 14th Amendment. So she's saying, Supreme Court, read the Constitution and give us the right to vote, enforce our right to vote. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, rejects Minor's claim in an opinion written by Chief Justice Morrison Waite. So effectively, the Supreme Court's rejecting the core argument of the new departure. In the end, the court agrees with Virginia Minor and her allies that women are US citizens, but the court concluded that voting wasn't a right of national citizenship protected by the 14th Amendment. Effectively, what Chief Justice Waite says is you can't look to the Constitution for this. Instead, if you want the right to vote, either look to the amendment process or look to your states. That's where the Constitution leaves this question moving forward.
Fantastic. And I think that this is a good moment to pause and think about what's the role of the Constitution is really to set that baseline. You can't go below the Constitution, but with states, and especially when we talk about voting, it's up to the states and they can go above. So you can't deny, men or African-American men, but you can include more, and that would be based in the states. And that's federalism mixed in there as well. So if we're talking 1875, how many states at this time are allowing women to vote? Earlier, you said New Jersey, New Jersey's claim to fame with blueberries and the Pine Barrens, and a few other things. But what do we really have? Is there a lot of states, a few?
I think the only place, and I'd have to, this is off the top of my head, I think the only place that's allowing full women's suffrage is the Wyoming Territory, which granted it in 1868. But as we'll see, Curry, the women's suffrage movement takes up Chief Justice Waite on his suggestions. And this next wave of reformers pushes for reform at the state level, but also begins pushing for a national amendment to the Constitution.
So they're going at it both ways, which is brilliant because you have to tactically do that as well. It's ground up and tops down. Okay, so who are these kind of like leaders and how are they moving it forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first let's start with the story in the states. So this is just a state-by-state grassroots effort to secure women's suffrage, again, sort of at sort of a state-by-state level, viewed one way. The 19th Amendment story here ends up being a great example of the states functioning, as Louis Brandeis famously envisioned, as laboratories of democracy. So the idea here is the Constitution grants states a ton of power over elections and voting. So if we want big national reform, the best way to get it is to start with experiments in the states. If people who oppose women's suffrage find it dangerous, they think it's not going to work, let's prove them wrong. And the way to prove them wrong is to find some states that are willing to boldly experiment and grant women the right to vote. And so this story ends up being one that begins out west. So as I said, the first win actually comes in 1869 with the Wyoming Territory, but we see other states out west also grant women the right to vote. So this is decades before the 19th Amendment. We have women with full voting rights out west in places like Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Utah. And you know what happens? The world doesn't explode. The experiment works. People see that women can take on the responsibilities of citizenship and being full political equals. And in the end, we see the women's right to vote spread from the West, all the way into the East. And so we see women's suffrage go to Washington, California, Arizona, Kansas, Oregon, Montana, Nevada, until finally it extends further east to some really big states, including New York in 1917 and Michigan in 1918. And so we see even before sort of by 1919, 15 states in the United States permit full women's suffrage, so a full women's right to vote even before the 19th Amendment, 15 states, including big states like New York, California, and Michigan. But we also see in other states that don't grant women full voting rights, we see partial suffrage in a lot of these states. And so women are granted the right to vote in things like presidential elections or school board elections. So we see the women's suffrage, the experiment that happens in the states and in local governments, it expands broadly to sweep the nation until finally we decide to write that idea into the Constitution.
And I love that. I also find it fascinating that these states were the first states to really embrace a mail-in ballots too.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something to be said about like it's far away. And so mail-in ballots are helpful. Now on to my favorite part of this story, we get to talk about marches and protests. And I always like to remind everybody that the first protest ever at the White House are women. So tell us about kind of, you said it earlier, they're taking a state by state attack. They're going for a national attack with the Constitution. And they're really, really getting the attention of people and saying, we're going to make change. And this is almost unheard of at the time. And a new wave of leadership comes into the women that says, no, we need to push hard on this. And that means protest. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of this, Curry, is growing out of what we already talked about with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They're focusing as early as in the 1870s on pushing for a national amendment to the Constitution. They actually settled on the language of the 19th Amendment in the 1870s. They call it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and it doesn't change. And that amendment proposal is presented to Congress every session for 40 years until Congress finally approves it. So we see some conventional focus on national amendments and national lobbying. One of the key leaders there, as we get into the 20th century, is Carrie Chapman Catt, who is the key congressional lobbyist for women's suffrage. So we see some conventional lobbying at the national level for a national amendment. But we also see, as you've already said, Curry, the use of other levers of direct action to push for greater visibility and greater change at the national level. One is what we see here, the women's suffrage procession of 1913. It's a massive parade in Washington, D.C. that takes place, marching, as you can see there, from the Capitol all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's scheduled the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It's a time where everyone's focused on Washington. So we have, in the end, 5,000 women coming to Washington to march in support of women's suffrage. As they proceed down Pennsylvania Avenue, they're met with violence. And so there are violent rabble-rousers there. Over 100 women end up inside the hospital. And so Wilson now has to share the headlines of his inauguration with his violence that happened against women who are supporting women's suffrage. And so this is a use of the parade, a gathering of people to bring greater visibility to the suffrage cause. We also see, unfortunately, though, in this women's suffrage possession, also some of the frictions over issues of race within the women's suffrage movement, where parade organizers say that African-American the suffragists, they need to march separately at the back of the parade. And so giving into some of the racial bias of the time. But we see ultimately 4 states march with fully integrated processions. And we also see key figures like Ida B. Wells, who was one of the most important civil rights figures of the era. The parade sergeant says, I'm not staying at the back of the parade. And she just marches right up and marches with her Illinois delegation. But again, it shows how the combination with this parade of both what's inspiring and also some of the complicated history that we find within the women's suffrage movement. And then the story Curry already previewed is we also see other suffragists bring even more radical militant tactics to the suffragist cause. And so, in 1917, the US enters World War I against Germany. Some, on the one hand, the war itself, many women proved their loyalty to the United States during the war effort. And with that, many people go to the women's suffrage cause because of all the support women have given to the war at the home front. That's part of the story here of how the World War I helps lead to the 19th Amendment. But also we see another set of suffragists led by Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party lead the first protest ever in front of the White House. And so here you can see them right here. We think of that as like, of course there's protests in front of the White House. It happens all the time. Anytime you go to Washington, D.C., there's always someone protesting something. But these are the great innovators. And so these women, they show up every day, they protest, they say, effectively, Woodrow Wilson, you're bringing us into a war to fight for democracy around the world, but you're disenfranchising half of us here at home. And so as the war effort proceeds, we see a crackdown on protests by the Wilson administration, including many of these women who were protesting in front of the White House. They end up being thrown in jail. They're mistreated. And there's a public outrage as to how these women are treated, which help, again, push the public in the direction of women's suffrage. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson, who was a great flip-flopper or fence-sitter when it came to women's suffrage, is convinced by the suffragists, by the war context, et cetera, to finally give his support to the 19th Amendment in January 1918. Congress then approves of the 19th Amendment in 1919, sending it to the states for ratification. And then the states themselves finally ratify the 19th Amendment 15 months later in August 1920.
Now, Tom, I know we have to wrap up here, and there's so many questions I have for you because I always want to unpack how these world wars affect the fight for equality on the home front, and not just women, but also African-American men and African-American soldiers coming home and, seeing just the different world and how, Alice Paul learned so much of what she saw in protests from the women's rights movement in England. So we could talk about that later, but it always amazes me, these major pivot points in world history and with these wars and how it affects a fight for equality on the home front. But real quick, could you tell us a little bit about the fight for the Black woman's right to vote and how that struggle had to continue and was not won by the 19th Amendment?
Yeah, sure. So, November 1920, we see women across the country vote under the 19th Amendment. President Warren Harding wins the presidency in a landslide with 60% of the vote. But at the same time, for millions of women, particularly women of color, the fight for the right to vote doesn't end there. Because much like African-American men, now African-American women, especially in the South, are kept away from the polls by intimidation, by violence, and by Jim Crow laws throughout the South. And so, unfortunately, many of the African-American women's suffragist allies in the movement among the white women suffragists, they don't really so much join the cause of the African-American women to push for the right to vote. So we see African-American men and women unite together in the long civil rights movement that we see from the 1920s all the way up into the 1950s and 1960s. And it's through those efforts that eventually we get the landmark law known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally swept away Jim Crow laws in the South that kept African Americans from being able to vote. We see an explosion of African American voter participation after the Voting Rights Act is passed, both from African American men, but African American women. So it ends up being a combination of the 19th Amendment and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a law pushed by the civil rights movement and eventually passed by Congress and signed by the president. They finally provide equal voting rights for women.
Finally, going back to the original call with Victoria Woodhull saying no, you have your power, use it. And it happens in 1965. Tom, that was fantastic. Thank you for walking us through all of that history, all kind of the turns and tucks and sideways directions that it goes, but it's really unbelievably fascinating. Students, I will make sure I send everybody the recording and the documents that Tom was sharing and the cases that Tom was sharing. And if you have any questions, always you can reach out, let me know. We are here and Tom and I will get those answers back to you. So Tom, thank you so much. Students, thank you so much. And we'll see you all next time in class.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Thank you, everyone.